Huerfano County, Colorado, September 1898. The miners were still below ground when the sound began above them. Not hammering, not sawing, not the clean clack of a carpenter setting a board. It was lower than that. Thud, thud, thud. On a brown slope above the Cucaras River, a man named Pietro Vassari was pounding wet dirt between two wooden boards. He was not making bricks. He was not patching a shed. He was building a house. And to every man in the company camp, it looked like the slowest possible way to make a mistake. The coal company had sold the miners one idea of shelter: thin pine walls, a tar paper skin, a coal stove in the corner, and a prayer that the wind would not find the seams. Pietro was building something that rejected all of it. No pine boards, no hollow walls, no narrow rectangle, no polite little cabin. His house had 12 sides. Its walls were almost 2 feet thick, and every foot of it was being made from the reddish clay and gravel he had dug out of the same hill where it stood. Jonathan Cade, the mine paymaster, stopped on the track road with his ledger under one arm. Cade trusted things that could be measured, invoiced, stacked, and deducted from wages. Lumber made sense to him. Nails made sense. Coal made sense. But this man was packing mud into a wooden mold as if mud could become a wall. "Vassari," Cade called. "I've charged men for shingles, stovepipe, window glass, hinges, and board feet. I have never once opened an account for a load of wet hillside." A few miners laughed. Pietro looked up. He was 39, narrow through the waist, heavy in the shoulders, with black hair pasted to his forehead by sweat and clay dust. His hands were wrapped around a tamping rammer with an iron-capped end. "It is not mud," he said. The accent came from the Italian mountain country, where men learned to build with whatever the land would surrender. "It is terra battuta, rammed earth." One of the timbermen spat into the dust. "Earth belongs under a house, not around your children." Cade stepped closer and studied the first wall lift. It rose from a low stone base in a dense band of red-brown earth, smooth where the boards had just been stripped away. It looked less like construction than excavation in reverse. "You know what spring will do to that?" Cade said. "Water will climb through it, frost will split it, rain will turn it back into the slope you stole it from." Pietro wiped one palm on his trousers and rested the rammer against the form. "The water will not climb," he said. "The wall will not split." "And when the stove goes out?" Pietro looked at the unfinished 12-sided ring of earth. "Then the walls will give the fire back." The men laughed harder at that. A wall, to them, was a shield, a thing that kept weather on one side and people on the other. It did not give anything back. Cade closed his ledger with a snap. "Well," he said, "when your dirt palace melts, I suppose we'll know exactly where to find you." Pietro picked up the rammer again. Thud, thud. Thud. The sound followed Cade down the road. Not fast, not impressive, not civilized. But it was the sound of a man charging a battery no one else could see. Pietro Vassari had not come to Colorado to become an inventor. He had come because the mines paid cash. In the stone villages above Lake Como, where he was born, cash was scarce, timber was precious, and weather was an old enemy. His father had built cowsheds into hillsides. His uncles had repaired thick-walled farmhouses that stayed cool in July and refused to freeze in January. Nobody there spoke of thermal mass. Nobody needed to. They had learned the rule with their skin. A light wall changes its mind with the air. A heavy wall remembers. When Pietro arrived in the Colorado coalfields with his wife Rosa and their children, Nino and Elisabetta, the company gave them the same shack it gave almost everyone else. A narrow board and batten box set on shallow posts, with one iron stove and gaps that sang whenever the wind came off the Sangre de Cristo range. Their first winter in that shack did not feel like a season. It felt like a trespasser. The cold entered before dawn and stayed after the sun. It filmed the inside of the windows with white feathers of frost. It stiffened boot leather until the soles curled. It made the tin plates on the shelf ache when Rosa touched them. At night, Pietro would bank the stove, wake 3 hours later to a room that had already surrendered, and feed it again with coal he could not afford to waste. One morning, Rosa set bread dough near the stove to rise, close enough that the crock was warm on one side. By noon, the outside of the dough had formed a cold gray skin. The fire was roaring. The room was losing. That was when Pietro understood the cabin's cruelty. It did not merely fail to hold heat. It trained a family to think heat was something that had to be chased every minute, with fuel, with blankets, with breath held under quilts. The miners called that normal. Pietro called it bad building. A company shack was quick to assemble because it was mostly empty space. Thin boards, hollow corners, loose joints. Every crack became a little chimney pulling warm air out and dragging cold air in. The stove heated the room sharply. Then the heat rushed through the walls as if the house were made of paper. Wood can be a useful material, but thin wood has little heat storage. It warms fast. It cools fast. In a coal camp, that meant a family could burn fuel all evening and still wake to ice in the wash basin. The men blamed the stove. Pietro blamed the walls. He started planning in the spring, not on paper at first, but by walking. He tested the hill clay in his fist. Too much silt, and it would crumble. Too much pure clay, and it would shrink. The right mix had tooth. It held shape when squeezed, but broke cleanly when dropped. He dug below the topsoil and found what he wanted. Reddish clay marl with small gravel already in it. He hauled sharper sand from the creek bed. He bought straw sweepings from a rancher who thought he was selling trash. He burned shells and limestone scraps into lime for the plaster coat. And before he raised a single earth wall, he built the part his critics could not see as clever. The foundation. Pietro laid sandstone and lime mortar in a continuous 12-sided ring 22 inches above grade, with a drainage trench outside it and flat capstones on top. He knew wet earth could drink water upward if it touched damp ground, so he refused to let the wall touch it. That stone base was not decoration. It was the line where the ground stopped and the house began. Then came the shape. The camp built rectangles because sawmills made straight boards and men liked right angles. Pietro's plan looked strange because it was chasing a different master. Surface area. For the same living space, a long rectangle exposes more wall to the cold. A square exposes less. A circle exposes the least. But a true circle is difficult when you are setting wooden forms by hand. A 12-sided house was Pietro's compromise with winter. Almost round, still buildable. Compared with a square cabin of similar floor area, It cut roughly a tenth of the exterior wall that could bleed heat into the night. Before the material did anything, the geometry had already reduced the fight. The camp did not see geometry. It saw a foreigner making a barn for a compass. Through October, Pietro and Rosa worked the forms. They shoveled 6 inches of damp earth into the narrow space between planks. Pietro tamped it until the layer became 3 inches of dense, locked material. Rosa listened for the sound as carefully as he did. A hollow thump meant weakness. A ringing, dead thud meant the air pockets were gone. Layer after layer, the wall rose. The children carried straw in baskets. Rosa trimmed the edges where the forms had shifted. Pietro set rough cedar ties at the angled joints and packed earth around them so the panels would grip each other as they cured. When the forms came off, the walls showed faint horizontal bands like the grain of a cliff. People kept coming to look. Some came to mock. Some came because they could not stop looking. Jonathan Cade returned every Saturday with a new reason the house would fail. First it would melt, then it would crack, then it would sweat. Then the roof would push the angled walls apart. Then the walls would trap bad air and sicken the children. Pietro rarely answered more than a sentence. Rosa answered once. Kate had just said that a proper American house needed proper American lumber. Rosa turned from the scaffolding, clay on her sleeves, and looked down at him. "In your country," she said, "a man pays the company for boards, then pays the company for coal because the boards cannot hold warmth. In our country, we try not to pay twice for the same mistake." The miners laughed at Cade that time. He did not return the next Saturday. By the first snow, the walls stood almost 9 feet high and 22 inches thick. Pietro roofed the house with heavy rafters, a steep pitch, and deep overhangs to throw rain beyond the earthen walls. He lime-plastered the exterior to shed weather and burnished the interior smooth with clay slip until it had the muted sheen of old pottery. Inside, there were no partition walls. That was deliberate. At the center, Pietro built a squat masonry heater, not a thin iron stove shoved into a corner. Its firebox was small. Its stone body was thick. Its flue rose through the middle of the roof. When it burned, heat radiated outward in every direction and struck every one of the 12 walls. The house was not arranged like a box with a hot corner. It was arranged like a clock face with fire at the center. Every wall was a number on the dial. Every wall received the flame. Here is the part the camp had missed. A house does not only lose heat through drafts. It loses heat through impatience. A thin cabin heats quickly because there is not much of it to heat. That feels good for an hour. But the moment the fire falls, the heat disappears. The air warms, the air leaks, and the family starts over. Pietro's house did the opposite. At first, it seemed slow. The walls did not leap to warmth. They absorbed. The fire's radiation struck the dense earth and moved inward little by little. The first inch warmed, then the next. The mass took energy the way a mill pond takes rain, quietly, deeply, without showing much on the surface. Those walls weighed more than 60 tons. Not 60 tons of decoration, 60 tons of heat storage. If a pine wall was a sheet of paper held near a candle, Pietro's wall was a hearthstone. It took longer to warm, but once warmed, it refused to forget. When the fire was allowed to fall to coals, The air cooled first. Then the walls, now warmer than the room, began releasing heat back. Not as a blast, not as a red stove that burns the knees and leaves the back cold. As a low, even radiation from all sides. The miners were used to heating air. Pietro was heating the house. By late December, the difference became visible in small humiliations. In the board cabins, men slept in caps and coats. Children dressed beside the stove because the corners were too cold. Water pails froze near doors. Coal bins emptied faster than pay envelopes filled. In Pietro's 12-sided house, the fire burned modestly in the morning and again in the evening. The walls carried the middle hours. Rosa could leave a kettle away from the heater without finding a skim of ice on it. Nino played on the floor. Elisabetta stopped coughing at night. Still, Cade did not believe it. Comfort was not a number in his ledger. Then January arrived with the kind of cold that makes numbers useless. For 11 nights the sky remained perfectly clear. No clouds, no wind, no mercy. The heat of the earth radiated upward into a black vault of stars, and the temperature fell to 27 below zero. In the company rows, stovepipes ticked and shrank. Door latches burned bare fingers. Frost gathered around nail heads inside walls until each cabin looked pierced by white buttons. The mine did not stop. Coal had to move. On the 7th night of the freeze, Jonathan Cade stayed late at the scale house, reconciling a disputed load. By the time he stepped outside, the lantern glass had frosted at the edges, and his mustache had stiffened. The road back to the office was only half a mile, but cold changes distance. It made every yard feel negotiated. He walked with his head down until he saw a shape above the road. Low, dark, 12-sided. Pietro's dirt house. A thin thread of smoke rose from the center chimney, but not much. Cade stared at it with anger first. A house should not look calm in weather like that. It should be fighting. It should be roaring. It should be bleeding smoke and sparks like every other place in camp. Then his left foot went numb, and pride became smaller than survival. He climbed the slope and knocked. Rosa opened the door. Warmth came out, but not the violent breath of an overheated stove. It was soft, almost weightless. Cade stepped inside and stopped so abruptly that Rosa had to close the door behind him. The room was not hot. That was what confused him. It was simply warm everywhere. There was no ring of desperation around the heater, no family huddled in the center, no children red-faced on one side and shivering on the other. Nino sat on a rug, repairing a toy wagon. Elisabetta slept with one arm outside her blanket. Pietro was at the table, mending a leather hinge on a toolbox. The fire in the masonry heater had burned down to a red seam. Cade looked at the walls. Their clay surface held the lamplight in a dull amber glow. He walked to the nearest one and put his gloved hand against it. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the drama. It did not suck heat from him. He pulled off the glove and touched the wall with bare fingers. The surface was not stove hot. It was not even what a man would call warm in summer. But in that winter room, it was unmistakable. A steady, mild warmth, as if the wall had a pulse too slow for the body to hear. Cade pressed his palm flatter. Then he turned and saw the proof that ruined him. On the table beside Rosa's flour sack sat a covered bowl. The cloth over it was lifted at the center, rounded by dough pushing upward from beneath. Bread dough. Rising. At 27 below zero. In every other cabin, water had frozen inside pails. In the commissary, potatoes had gone hard as stones near the outer wall. Men were thawing boots under stoves before they could put them on. And here, several feet from a dying fire, yeast was alive enough to lift bread. Cade pointed at the bowl. "How long has that been there?" "Since supper," Rosa said. "Not by the heater?" She shook her head. Cade looked back at Pietro. For years, Cade had thought a good house was one that kept weather out. He had never considered that a wall could be part of the fire, that it could take heat, hold it, and spend it slowly through the night. He ran one hand along the clay again. His voice lost the sharpness the camp knew. "You did not build a wall," he said. Pietro waited. Cade swallowed. "You built a bank for the fire." After that night, the jokes changed into questions. Men who had laughed at the dirt house began arriving in pairs. They knocked on Sundays. They asked about the clay. They asked how wet the mix should be. They asked why the base was stone, why the walls leaned nowhere, why the roof hung so far beyond them. Cade came too, carrying not a ledger but a folding rule. He measured the wall thickness twice. The second time he wrote it down. The freeze broke near the end of January. The company shacks came through with burst jars, warped boards, and families exhausted from feeding stoves. Pietro's house came through with dry walls, an intact plaster skin, and a coal pile that had not disappeared. That coal pile mattered more than admiration. In a company town, every saved bucket of fuel was a small rebellion. It meant less debt, less dependence, less of a miner's wage circling back into the same office that paid it. By spring, Cade had done the arithmetic he trusted. Pietro's household had burned far less coal through the worst stretch of winter than neighboring cabins of similar size. Not because they were colder, because they were not heating the night sky. He sent the figures to a Denver Italian language paper, along with a rough drawing of the 12-sided plan. The editor printed the story under a headline about an old mountain method in a new coal country. The local mutual aid society copied the drawing by hand. Soon, in camps near Walsenburg and Aguilar, other Italian families began experimenting with thick earth walls, raised stone bases, and compact shapes that gave the wind less surface to steal from. Not every house was as good as Pietro's. Some men mixed the soil too wet. Some made walls too thin. Some forgot the roof overhangs. Earth building rewards patience and punishes shortcuts. But the idea had escaped. The company had taught miners to think shelter came from purchased boards and rented coal. Pietro reminded them that shelter could also come from mass, shape, drainage, and memory. The science sounds modern because the language is modern. Building envelopes, heat sinks, passive thermal storage, surface to volume ratio, radiant comfort, thermal flywheel. Pietro did not use those words. He used clay. He used stone. He used a shape closer to a circle than a box. He used a central fire that warmed the structure instead of merely overheating the air. And he used the oldest principle of winter survival. Do not waste what you have already suffered to make. The men in the camp had believed a wall was a boundary. Pietro knew a wall could be a reservoir. That was the difference between a shack that begged for coal and a house that remembered the flame. In the end, the miracle was not that dirt became hard. Men had known that for thousands of years. The miracle was that a poor miner looked at the material everyone else walked over, dug under, and dismissed, and saw a machine. A slow machine. A silent machine. A machine with no moving parts, no smoke, and no account in the company ledger. All winter it performed its work in darkness. It took the day's fire into itself and returned it when the family needed it most. The camp laughed because Pietro Vassari built with earth. Then the cold came, and the earth paid back every flame.